The Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am March Hunter, the host of the program. Our American Heritage program where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning to the present. And today we want to welcome as our guest, Rebecca Stevens. So Rebecca, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And I hope it's okay if I call you Beck, not Rebecca.
Absolutely. So all anybody knows me by.
Okay, cool. Please share with our listeners before we get into your topic a little bit of your background and your educational background and what you're currently doing.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I did my undergraduate education at St. Lawrence University, where I was a history major and education minor. And then I completed my master's degree at Le Moyne College here in Syracuse. I have a master's of science in education from Le Moyne. And when I graduated from St. Lawrence, the week before I graduated, I was offered a position at Fayetteville Manlius School District teaching 7th grade social studies, which is the first half. I say half in quotations because it goes up through the Civil War, which feels like a whole lot more than half. But I've been teaching at Fayetteville Manlius at Eagle Hill Middle School, 7th grade, since I started teaching. So I'm about to enter year 24 of teaching U.S. history there.
So you've been teaching 24 years, or this is your 24th year, and you've been teaching 7th graders, and you're still normal, and you're still sane?
Well, normal is questionable.
Well, you're sane, correct?
I love somewhat sane, yes. Actually, I love 7th graders, and I always tell everyone that if they ever moved me to the high school, I'd retire because 7th graders are a really neat mix of fun and challenge, and I like that.
Well, all I can say is God bless you for teaching middle school. And a little bit of your family, please, so our listeners can get to know you a little bit.
Well, my husband and I both grew up in Glens Falls, New York, and we connected many years after I actually had started teaching. And so we got married and we live in a suburb of Syracuse. We are dog parents. We have 2 adorable little boys who are a lot of fun, and you may get to hear them during our time.
That's okay. We're big dog lovers over here, so good.
Yeah.
And one more question. How long have you been married?
How long have we? It will be 10 years this January.
Wow. Well, congratulations.
Yeah.
Do you have him straightened out yet, or you still need a few more years too?
Oh no, I need a lot more years.
Wow. Well, my wife and I have been married almost 31 years, and she said her job is just still in the beginning stages. So now you're going to talk about the graffiti houses of the Civil War. But before you do that, I want to throw you a little bit of a curveball, if you don't mind. And if you don't want to touch this, I'm perfectly fine with that. 24 years you've been teaching. I have dealt with this my whole teaching career. And as I look through your resume, you have a lot of experiences and background of giving information to teachers and dealing with different organizations where you've accumulated a lot of knowledge. Do you get the same feeling I do when I hear so many people say, well, they're just not teaching American history anymore?
Oh, that makes me so angry.
Okay.
So I think that what I have seen is I've seen through these I've traveled a lot with different teacher organizations and have been exposed to a lot of great things. And my experience with history teachers is they are teaching American history. They're working really hard, fighting really hard to keep it in the curriculum where it keeps getting pushed aside by math and ELA. But I think now more than ever, what we do in the American history classroom is so important to understanding our nation's history, to really getting a grasp of what we've been through, where we've been, and how that made us who we are today.
And I know that the feeling that we share, that feeling when we hear that, particularly you put so much time and effort into continuing to further your own personal knowledge, particularly in the summer. And you incorporate that into your classrooms. And I know thousands of teachers. And, when we hear that statement from people, well, they're just not teaching history anymore, what that really does to us. And number one, it's very insulting. Number two, it angers us because of particularly what the knowledge, the continuing education that all of us have put in, or most of us have put in, to continue to teach the kids of America. So Thank you for that.
Yeah, the idea that teachers have the summers off. Most summers I'm doing at least 2 institutes, often 3 week-long institutes where I've read, 1,000 pages of readings to prep for them. And then, I'm creating lesson plans or different things after doing summer curriculum projects for school. Summers off is kind of a misnomer.
Yes, it certainly is. So I wish more people would understand that. So talk to us, please, about this topic that you presented to me. It's just a fascinating topic because it's so different from usually what so many people want to talk about. So share with us the graffiti houses of the Civil War, please.
Absolutely. So many years ago, I applied for a National Endowment for Humanities Landmarks in American History grant to go to a teacher program about graffiti houses. And I was like, what the heck is a graffiti house? So there are about 60 sites. Most of them are in Virginia, in churches, courthouses, caves, private homes, where soldiers during the Civil War wrote their names, they drew pictures, they had all these different things on the walls of these houses. And over time, people wallpapered over these charcoal drawings, these, names. Some of them are infantry names and different things. And so there's over 60 of these places. So this Graffiti Houses Teacher Institute that I went to, we visited 3. So we visited the Ben Lomond Historic Site that had been used as a hospital. And if you ever get a chance to go there, it's really cool because they actually have the rooms set up so that you feel like you're in a hospital. And to the extent that they use scents, and so they have a gangrene scent pod that they put a fresh one in when they knew the teachers were coming. So that was... I was like, thanks, that's great. But, they showed how they used the doors of the house as operating tables. And so in Ben Lomond, you can see on the walls, last wills and testaments, because this is a hospital. So you've got Union soldiers who don't think they're ever going to make it out. And so they take charcoal from the fireplace and write on the wall their last will and testament. Then there's the Blenheim House is another one that we visited. That one was also used as a hospital. Typically, they don't allow people to go into the attic because obviously it's irreplaceable. But when you get a bunch of geeky history teachers, we get to go places that other people don't. And so they brought us up into this attic. And in the attic, there were all these pictures and stuff. And I actually pulled one up that I took a picture of. And it says 4th month, no money, no whiskey, no, I think it says no friends, no rations, no tents. And then it's signed the guy's name. And so you can just see, it brings you kind of into their world. You go up into this attic and you go, oh my goodness. Now, the typical tourist, they have an exact replica of the walls and you can go through that part and then you can tour the downstairs of the home. But we actually got to go up in the attic. And then the final site they brought us to was this place called Brandy Station. And this was a store that was at a railroad kind of junction. And in this place, it was hidden under wallpaper until the year 1993. And both the Union and Confederacy had occupied this place. And the walls were literally plastered with, United States of America and just huge writing and names. And supposedly there's a Jeb Stuart signature there. So Brandy Station was the final one. Brandy Station is the only one that was privately run when we visited it, but just a really neat collection of walls just covered in this graffiti. And so it was really just an experience that I was like, oh my goodness, wow.
You said that most of them are in Virginia. Is there a reason why most of them are particularly in the state of Virginia?
I think because it was the location between the two capitals, between the capital of the Confederacy and the Union, that kind of 100-mile stretch area in there, that at least from the reading that we did for this class, that was kind of what we had learned was that area had kind of gone back and forth. So it was a kind of territorial thing, like, hey, we're in this house and we're going to mark our turf and, leave our mark here. So.
And were you able to distinguish between the writing on the wall, whether it was a Union soldier or a Confederate soldier?
So what we did was they told us, like when we were in this house, hey, look for these names, or in this house, look for these names, because at the National Archives, they have, for the Union, they have the cumulative military service records of every Union soldier who was enlisted. And so you can connect these people whose names are on the wall to the National Archives to like verify that, oh my goodness, that person was in this regiment, who fought in these battles, and kind of piece it together that way.
And of all the places, particularly what you did with the National Endowment of Humanities and other ongoing learning, that share with our listeners the value of going to these sites and learning so much on those sites so that you can then transpose it back into the classroom.
Well, I think that you don't really understand history until I feel like when you walk the ground, you get this feeling, like when you're at Pickett's Charge in Gettysburg. And I've actually walked all of Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, and you get this feeling of, oh my goodness, like these people that were here, they had a family, it makes a kind of personal connection. And then I feel like that's when history becomes real. And, you're standing in this attic, in this brick, the stone house in Virginia, and you're looking at the wall and you're going, wow, like these soldiers were here. You think about what medical practices were like in the Civil War. They're in these Civil War hospitals, maybe have had something amputated or whatever. And you see their drawings, and you see, there were a lot of ships drawn in the attic at Blenheim, and there were images of soldiers. And all of a sudden it's like it kind of makes a connection. It humanizes history, I guess. Instead of it being in a storybook, it makes it have that human element of, oh my goodness, like these were actual people that were experiencing this.
And I know that you and I both share the mantra that the study of history is not facts and dates, it's the study of human behavior. So you really touch human lives when you go and visit these places. Share with our listeners, please, what you learned from so many of the valuable things that you learned by visiting these three sites, and then how you were able to take that into your classroom to teach your seventh graders.
Well, so in the Civil War, about 90% of the Union soldiers, they believe, were literate. But literate comes in all shapes and sizes. And so a lot of them were not, some were writing letters home and were writing diaries and stuff, but some of them, we don't really know a lot about their experience. And so this activity of finding a soldier's name and then going to the National Archives was kind of like a snapshot in time. These soldiers, part of the reason they're making their mark, they're leaving their name. There's no dog tags. Dog tags don't come around till the Spanish-American War. So this is like their kind of last chance. It's kind of like an immortality thing. There was a quote from Drew Gilpin Faust in one of the articles we read in preparation for this. It says, if a soldier could not save his life, he hoped at least to preserve his name. Huh. And so that, that graffiti was like a kind of final act of like, hey, I was here. I did something with my life, remember me. And so at Blenheim House, we were kind of assigned a group, and our group found Amos Phillips is the guy's name. And so Amos Phillips was on the wall. So we knew nothing about him other than that his name was on the wall. So then we went to the National Archives, which that's like a bucket list moment for me, to be able to touch Civil War documents with my hands, at the National Archives. First of all, to go into the National Archives as a history person is pretty amazing, but they pulled out the compiled military service records. And so in the Civil War, soldiers had to muster to be paid. And so they would muster, that means they'd line up. And it's also kind of how they could track the movement of the soldiers. They would know, hey, so-and-so is in the hospital this month, or so-and-so is present or absent. Sometimes it would say, sometimes it would just say not present. And so you can kind of see, okay, this soldier was here at this point. And so it says the location, it says the date. And so you can kind of piece together the story of, okay, this guy was sick for like 4 months, or, this person, this happened. So all of a sudden, Amos Phillips, we knew, okay, he's in the 44th Infantry for New York. So when you know that, then you can start to piece together, well, what action did the 44th see? Oh, the 44th was at Gettysburg. So as part of this Teacher Institute, we went to Gettysburg. And so we're standing at Little Round Top, and on Little Round Top, there's a monument to the 44th New York. So one of the cool things that happened with our group was we had learned that Amos Phillips fought at Gettysburg. So we went on to Little Round Top at Gettysburg. And if you're standing at the top of Little Round Top looking toward Devil's Den, off to the left, there's a monument there. And it turned out it was a monument to the 44th New York Regiment. And so our group got all excited because we were like, oh my goodness, this is our guys' regiment. And so people went in, and like inside underneath, they have a plaque with all of the members of the 44th New York. And on the plaque was Amos Phillips. So, but what's interesting is that when we looked at the compiled military service record, Amos Phillips had deserted for a couple months, and he came back in June of 1863. So what a time to come back to this regiment. Like, oh my goodness, if he'd only known, he may have stayed out a little longer of what he was going to encounter. So
share with our listeners, please, when they go to Little Round Top and they look down at the Devil's Den, exactly where that monument is. So when they go there, they can know exactly what monument.
So if you're standing at the top of the hill where you have that overview and you're looking down at Devil's Den, Devil's Den's kind of to the left as you look down. If you look left on the paved part that you're standing on and walk down, there's like a thing that you can climb. You can climb into the top of this little tower. That monument is the 44th New York, and Amos Phillips' name is inside underneath.
And it kind of looks like a miniature castle, doesn't it, Fred?
Yes, it does. Yeah. It looks kind of like a stone castle.
And that's also the largest monument on Little Round Top, isn't it?
Yes, it is the biggest monument there.
Okay. So our listeners know when they go there exactly what they can go and look at. Thank you. Okay, so I'm sorry. Continue on, please. No, so Amos was away, and then he came back right before Gettysburg.
He came back right before Gettysburg, June 1863. And it's interesting because you can kind of piece together a little of his story that he was sick for quite a bit of time, like in and out of, and that was pretty common in the Civil War, that people, they were training all of the time and they, were sick. In March of 1863, he was marked as a loss and dropped from the roll. So that's kind of his desertion. And then he returned in May of June 1863 on the cumulative record. It says that he returned from desertion. And then there's a list of costs. Like, you owe us for transportation, for new clothing, said 2 hammocks. And this regiment that he was part of, once you know what regiment they're in, then you can kind of break this down and you can start to explore more about, like, where did they end up? Where did this regiment go? So there was that kind of element of it where you can see what happens during the war. And then also at the National Archives, there are pension records. And the pension records are, after the war, all these guys went home and they want to get paid. They want to get paid for the rest of their lives. And one of the really interesting facts they gave us was that, let me see, I want to find it because I don't want to misspeak, that the pension records, in 1893, 43% of the federal budget was paying pensions. 43% of the federal budget was paying pensions. Can you imagine if that was our budget today? Like 43% is paying the pensions of all these soldiers. And those soldiers quickly realized that they were only giving pensions to widows, orphans, and those who were injured. And so you read these pension records and they're all talking about this chronic diarrhea that they've got. They're all talking about rheumatism because they know that those are some catchphrases that are getting people money. What was interesting in Amos Phillips' records is it said that there was a gunshot on his left side, but it was only in some of the doctor's reports. So, you begin to go, okay, was it really shot in the left side? Was, how reliable is this as a source that kind of injury is coming and going? So I thought that was pretty interesting. But our group was able to continue to trace his life by looking at these pension records. We were able to see his wife's experience. So he married in 1869 after the war, and he and his wife were pretty poor. She's begging desperately for money after he passes away. He died of septicemia after falling off a ladder. You could read in his pension record. So he dies in 1904. She lives all the way till 1925. And it's year after year after year of her trying to secure money because she's just desperate for this money that is his pension, even after. And there were all these different acts that like, hey, now because of this act, please, I need this money. So, but he and his wife are buried in Madison County, which was so cool for me. So I started with a name on a wall, Amos Phillips, in this attic in Virginia, and traced it all the way to the community that I'm literally 4 miles away from, the county that I live 4 miles away from. So, just talk about making historic connections. And so I then bring this to my students. And I think that's where history really comes to life for me, is to watch them experience it. So I start out with them and I say, okay, here's this house. And I show them a picture of the Blenheim house. And then I show them a picture of some of the walls of the attic with the different images. And then I show them this zoomed in name. And I say, I happen to have some records. Do you guys want to find out about this guy? And then, yeah, let's find out. And so I assign my students in different groups to start looking at this. So, some of my students are the decipherers because unfortunately we don't teach cursive anymore in our education, and all historic documents are written in cursive. So I rely on my students who went to Catholic school till 5th grade, and they become my decipherers. And so they're dealing with the pension records, which are written in cursive, and they're looking at the pension records, trying to piece together what's the story of him after the war. Then I have another group of students that have that cumulative service record, and they are in charge of trying to piece together a timeline of where was he when and what was going on and what was happening. And so they are starting to piece together the timeline. And once they know what regiment he's in, I have another group of students who are my Googlers, and they start to research about the New York 44th and to see if they can find anything, like Googling his name, like, does anything pop up? Like, is there anything? And we actually were able to find an image of his gravestone through doing this kind of method. And then I have my final group are my cartographers, and their job is to take a Civil War map and mark out his path during the Civil War. So by the end of that, my students are like, oh my goodness, like, we knew nothing about him, and look at what we can find and how we can piece this together. And I do this at the end of the year, and I was like, guys, this is history. I said, reading chapters in books, that's not history. This is history. Like, this is how you can experience history, and you can go to these amazing places. And, so I am not an assign a chapter of a textbook and read and answer questions teacher. So.
And we know, that is the most powerful form of having our students learn, is the hands-on and seeing it and when putting it together. So yeah. It makes history so much more alive. So, well, unfortunately, we are out of time for this session, but I would like to continue the conversation with you about the process and what you went through and other things, that the impact that Amos Phillips had in the classroom. So thank you for sharing the understanding and the background of the graffiti houses, and particularly with Amos Phillips and the impact that he has had on your life and your students' life. Thank you for coming and sharing with us, and we're going to continue our conversation with you in our next show. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
This is WFYL, Working for Your Liberty, 1180 AM.
The Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Baki Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
When you experience the loss of a loved one, you can trust the Spindler Myers Funeral Home and the Baki Funeral Home and Crematory to guide you through the arrangements necessary to create a meaningful ceremony that celebrates the unique life being honored. Our staff is committed to providing your family with the highest quality of care and service in your time of need. We take pride in our responsibility to lighten your burden as you take the first step towards healing. Ask us about how we create a unique service for your loved one. Spindler Myers Funeral Home and the Baki Funeral Home and Crematory also helps with planning ahead so all the details of the service are taken care of. Ask us how we can connect you with grief support networks in your area. Spindler Myers Funeral Home and the Baki Funeral Home and Crematory has the resources to compassionately guide you through the loss of your loved one.
Contact us at 610-272-1941. That's 610-272-1941. Or visit our website at myersfh.com. That's MEYERSFH.com.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am Arch Hunter, the host of the program. Our program is where we explore in depth the American experience from the beginning to the present. And this morning we want to welcome back as our very special guest, Beck Stevens. So Beck, thank you for coming back and welcome back to the program.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And in our last program, you were talking to our listeners about the graffiti houses of the Civil War, and you were sharing with our listeners exactly how you use that information, particularly with Amos Phillips in the classroom. That's where we ended. And I would like to pick back up there with you, and if you could review with our listeners how you use this information with your seventh graders.
Absolutely. So what I do is I start with an image of a house, and I tell them that this house is in Virginia, and it's a house that I had the privilege of visiting, and it was used as a hospital and also kind of a training ground area for soldiers during the Civil War. And so it's in Virginia. It was not far from Bull Run, and so I talk about how houses during the Civil War were taken over. They were commandeered by the conquering army. So this house, even though it was in Confederate territory, was taken over by the Union troops. And so I show this house, and then I say, what do you think might happen in a house like this during the course of the Civil War? And so, they talk about, well, maybe they took the furniture out and used it for something. And then we talk about, well, what could the furniture be used for, or what could a door be used for, and kind of talk about like what the impact on this house might be. And then I show them pictures of the attic walls, and they go, whoa, what is that? And I show them, drawings of these people and drawings of ships. And I say, how do you think it got there? And so then they start to think about that. And what would happen is these soldiers that are bored, they've got a lot of time on their hands, especially if they're injured or they're sick. And so they're drawing these kind of artistic masterpieces on the walls and writing their names and recording other poems and stuff. And so we start to have a conversation about, well, why might they do that? And kind of get them talking about that. And I said, well, you can actually tell people's names here. And so I said, here's this guy named Amos Phillips, and, his name's on the wall. And I said, how do you think we can learn more about him? And, seventh graders, modern day, they say Google. And I said, well, back then Google probably wasn't going to be a source that we could use, to find out more about them. And so I say, well, where would you do research if you were in school? Where would, and the library. And so we start to talk about, well, our library is probably not in depth enough to find Amos Phillips anywhere. So where else might we go? And so we get to the National Archives, and I talk about the fact that in the National Archives, and I actually have this statistic, there was 170 million pieces of Civil War documents. 170 million pieces.
Okay, I heard it right. 170 million. Wow.
Yes. And so, and the National Archives is actually trying to digitize that amazing library of 170 million pieces. So I said, well, I got to go to the National Archives, and I was actually a part of digitizing this information on Amos Phillips. And so I talk about, well, how do you think, what kinds of documentation might there be for a soldier in the Civil War? And they're like, well, diaries and letters. And I said, well, some people weren't really that literate. They were pretty poor. They worked on a farm. They might not, they may have been able to write their name and a little bit of other stuff. They might have been able to read some, but probably not writing letters. And so how do you think we can find out information about them? And so, I talk about the fact that, well, they had to get paid. And so how do you think they're keeping track of who to pay and when they pay them? And so we start talking about the idea of muster and the idea of lining up, once a month, tracking all the soldiers, because the chaos of battles or training, people are kind of all over the place. So this idea of muster and the fact that they kept really meticulous records of who was there when, because they were trying to figure out who to pay and, how that worked. And so I said, I was able to touch his compiled military service record. It's called the CMSR. And I said, and I was able to photograph it. And so I've got that. And what I have done is I've printed them all out, high quality images, and then laminated them. So I have them for years. My students can look at them and we're not damaging them. And I said, but I was able to digitize that also. So the National Archives, now you can, on the National Archives page, start to look at stuff like this. And so they let people come and do that. They can have volunteers come. And so we start to look at the cumulative service records. So some students are in charge of doing that, and they are in charge of trying to make a timeline of where was this guy and when. And so, as I said on our last time, one of the really fascinating things was that in March of 1863, he was marked as a loss and dropped from the rolls. But then in May of June of 1863, he returns, and it says he returned from desertion and he's got to pay all these different things. And so I talk with my students about, okay, so that's May, June. We just learned about the Civil War. What happened in July? and they're like, oh, the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, the 44th New York went there. And so, just that idea of having kids handling these documents and start to really see the impact of, like, we just finished learning about this. Now here's a human who lived through it, and somebody who we wouldn't know much about if we hadn't found his name and made this connection to the National Archives. And then I have another group that are working and using their cursive reading skills, and they are trying to figure out what happened in his life after the war. And we can find out, that he was married and that he ended up dying in 1904 and just the different things he experienced. And so the students have that access to, can you trust everything you see? Well, if they trace his pension records, there's this gunshot wound that keeps coming and going. And so, that you start to begin to question, you can't always trust, you need to look for corroboration, that idea of, comparing different documents. So that they really enjoy. And then I have another group that's working on figuring out where his regiment moved during the Civil War. So they've got a map of the Civil War battles, and they're tracing the timeline and seeing, how close was he to these other battles that maybe the regiment didn't participate in, or, what might be a reason, why were they involved here? Oh, well, that's because they were the closest group to there, or, so just kind of neat. And, after learning the Civil War unit to then be put hands-on and to be put with documents and to learn about the story of a person. At the end of the year, I always ask my kids, hey, what worked for you this year? What was really interesting to you? And this day always comes up as one of their favorites, because they said, we actually got to do history. We actually got to analyze history, really experience it. So it's one of their favorite activities.
And the activity that you do with your students with Amos Phillips, approximately how long does that take for them to do?
It's a day. It's one
It's
class
just a day.
period. It's just a class period. So, because we've got all the background of the war itself.
Okay.
So
this is a maybe accumulating activity, or
yeah, it's kind of I use it before I start to review for final exams, or before, like I might even do it before the test at the end of the unit. Like, okay, here's what we've learned all this unit, and now let's personalize it. Now let's put a face to it. Let's put a name to it.
And as we as teachers, that's one period that you do with your students. Do you know have any idea how long in preparation it has taken for you, even before this past year, to do it? In prep time, does it take for you to put all that together? So for one class period?
Oh my goodness. That was probably, just printing and laminating, it's 10 hours at least right there.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, tons of time, and lots of time thinking about, like, what can a 7th grader really do with this?
Yeah, and putting all that time and effort in, because so much of the teaching profession is the prep work coming in to present the lesson to the students, which so many.
Well, and that's one of the things that's interesting. I did an entire week-long institute on the War of 1812 at the USS Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing institute. I get to spend one period teaching the entire War of 1812. I teach a survey class, and people are like, well, why do you invest all this time in learning all this? And I said, because I can share a couple nuggets that I got from that I would never have learned.
Mm-hmm.
But if I can add those couple facts that like something that grasps the student, that makes them want to go, oh, wow, I never thought about it that way, then it's worth it.
Yeah. It brings the history alive on the human behavior to the students. Do you have any other background information on Amos Otis that you would like to share or could share with our listeners?
About Amos Phillips?
I'm sorry. Did I say Amos Otis? I'm sorry. That's a baseball player. I'm sorry. He played for the Braves.
Okay, transition right to baseball.
I'm sorry. My mind is one track. So Amos Phillips.
I'm looking here just at some of the notes I took on him. I think the coolest thing is that he's from the county next to where we live. But yeah, no, we don't know a lot else about him. We know, his experience in the war. We know he enlisted in 1861, which is pretty early to be enlisting. And, in 1861, people who were enlisting in the war thought, hey, this will be over in a few months. That's very common in the Civil War, that they thought, that what you hear about the Battle of Bull Run, where they brought their Sunday best because they thought that they packed picnics to go watch the Battle of Bull Run. Oh, this will be fun to watch the South turn and run, like, whoops, not quite that way. Right. And so I think that is so very interesting that he enlisted early in the war. We do know, just based on the pension records we see, that after the war, that he was never very wealthy, that, throughout his life, that money was definitely a financial struggle, as they keep pleading this case of, we need this money, we need to be involved. And so, here's somebody who is a hero, whose name is at Gettysburg. I mean, how many names are there on monuments at Gettysburg? Not a ton. And here he is, his entire life just trying to make it by. And, the reason so many people enlisted in the Civil War, for Amos Phillips, it was probably about, hey, I'm going to get a paycheck, and I need that. So.
And share with our listeners, in case they didn't hear last week, how long he lives after the Civil War, and what did he do for an occupation after the war was over?
He said he died in 1904. I did not find anything about work that he did. My guess is farming, but that's just a guess based on where we know he died. yeah, we do know that he fell off a ladder and died of septicemia, because that's in the pension records.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's kind of interesting, I mean, if I was really into this, I could probably go to that county and I could probably dig up more about him.
Sure.
And that's something that, students have said, well, you've gone and seen his gravestone in person, and I haven't. It's in the next county over, but that county is rather large, and, I just haven't gone out searching yet. But things like this are things that make kids think about, maybe I would like to find out more about this guy. Maybe that would be something interesting for me to do.
You said it in our first show that you are now beginning your 24th year in teaching, Beck. How has your teaching in the classroom evolved and changed over your 24 years? And what changes have you made in your teaching as you have continued to evolve as a teacher throughout the years?
I think that I am much less concerned with facts and dates. I think when you first start, you feel like they've got to memorize these facts. And I think I now am much more concerned with teaching kids to be analytical thinkers, to look at something and look at where did that source come from. I mean, right now, especially in our society today, we are inundated with facts that are from all over the place. You can't listen to the news without going, I don't know about that, and so really teaching kids to look at things with a critical eye of, okay, how can I figure out if this is real? And so, going back to Amos Phillips, how can I figure that, that idea of corroborating different sources, of looking for, okay, where there's, if we read this in one source and this in another source and this in another source, and 3 different sources are all talking about the same thing, it probably happened. But if there's, that one outlier that's saying something way off base, okay, maybe we need to look at the validity of that source. And kind of, I think that I've really gotten into that idea with my students. And, right now, even as we look at education, which is completely different from last March till even now, looking at teaching this year and what that's going to look like, I think the focus has really had to become how we get kids engaged in history. And, because I was stressing about content, how am I going to cover all this content? And at the end of the day, my goal as a teacher is to get kids to love history.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them come to me with, I don't like social studies, Mrs. Stevens. Well, why not? Because all we do is read the textbook and answer those questions at the end.
Right.
And I say, well, guys, we're not doing that this year. This year, you're going to become historians. And my goal is by the end of the year that there's something that I've talked about that if they saw an article in a newspaper or they saw that they'd want to read it, or that they want to pursue learning more about something. And if I can do that, if I can win those little victories, even in the course of teaching in a pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I'm looking for. And so my goal for this year is to get kids to love history and to learn something and to maybe be a little bit more critical thinkers.
And, we know over time as teachers, particularly more now than ever, how important it is to teach the kids to be critical learners and readers, because we're bombarded in so many different directions with so much information in social media and over the internet and so much of it is it's just fake. And how important it is for particularly for you in juncture to teach these kids learning what it is to be a critical learner and a lifelong learner.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's something that the last part you said about the lifelong learner, I think that that's something that I try to share over and over again. You know what? Over the weekend, I went here and I learned this, or I saw this, or, and when I'm teaching, I'm always sharing images that I've taken. I've walked there, guys, and this is what I experienced. And I even a few years ago decided I want to get my kids out and experiencing history. And so I developed an incentive that I call Destination History, where I have challenged them to go to a historic site, and it can be local, find a monument and read it and send me a picture and tell me one thing you learned. And they do that. And I kind of have incentivized that for them, but just to get them because I feel like that's so much of learning is actually experiencing. So,
and so many that I'm looking through your resume, there are so many opportunities that you have had in summers to go to these places, to go to these different organizations that you have mentioned and learn, on hands-on learning to be able to take back to your classroom. Is there one or two or three that you feel that has had the most impact on your teaching throughout your teaching career?
I'd say Fort Ticonderoga has really influenced me. So I did 3 different summers, I think in a row, 3 summers in a row at their teacher institutes. One was the National Endowment for Humanities, and then they also run their own program. And they really challenge you to incorporate primary sources. And so one of the things, because they can't get rid of me, in part, they said, "Hey, Beck, we have this primary source."
Beck. I'm sure that's not really how they feel, but
I'm a leech they simply can't get rid of. But they asked me, they said, "We found this cool source from a loyalist who lived in this area, and would you do something with it?" And so that, I think you and I are going to talk about this maybe on a future show, but would you do something with this source? And so, they've really taught me more about using primary sources, about really kind of getting students engaged with the primary sources. And another one I did was at Gettysburg. It was a Gilder Lehrman Institute, and it was all about material culture and about how to study material culture. So the objects, the physical things. And so at that teacher institute, Peter Carmichael, who is just phenomenal, he led us on a tour of Gettysburg where he actually would bring us to a place and he'd pull out a primary source and we'd start reading a diary entry or a letter from someone at that place. Or he'd bring us to a site like where Gardner photo had been taken, and he said, "See that rock? That's what they're sitting on in this picture." So he may have been taking apart fences at points and bringing us to places we probably weren't supposed to be, but it was pretty incredible. But as a result of that, that idea of material culture, I have my students all bring in an object that they think represents them, and they bring it in a brown paper bag, and they are not allowed to tell anybody which bag is theirs. And I have them all put them together. And then what we do is each student takes one object. And I said, you have to pretend that you live 1,000 years in the future and you have no idea what this object is. And so they look at, the material it's made of. They have to look at how it's constructed. Was it made by hand? Was it, made by a machine? Like how was this object made? And then based on what you're looking at, what could it be used for? And so they have to kind of throw away what they already know they know and go to what they don't know. And it's just this really cool, object lesson where they learn how to look at material culture, because we assign everything our own, 20/20 bias right now. But objects were used for different purposes. And so just kind of getting them to really analyze an object. And then, we finish with, it's kind of a getting to know you activity also, where they have to try to guess whose object it is. And then, and then they talk about how they really use the object. But so, for example, swim goggles come in. And so the students, I pretend you don't know those are swim goggles. What is it made of? What, how could it be used? And, so it turns into kind of, it's a fun activity, but also gets them talking about like how material culture can really be used to try to understand the past and to look at how things were made differently and how we can learn about the past. So that was another one that, like, that idea of using material culture and incorporating that in what we're learning about was a really huge one. I did this great travel. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was thinking when we were talking about being lifelong learners, and about 6 weeks ago, someone asked me a question about something that happened at Fort Ticonderoga, that Christmas riot of 1776, and I didn't know anything about it. And I know that I was at Fort Ticonderoga with you a couple summers ago, and it was hot as Hades. It was 99 degrees, and so as I began to read on that, I asked you about it, and so both of us went to work to try to find out some information about something we didn't know anything about, and that's the example of how we're lifelong learners. We can never be afraid to say, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know anything about that, and we're willing to go look at it and study it and get information upon so we can pass it on. And we need, as teachers, we need to be the example to our students and all the other adults of what it is to be a lifelong learner. And this is what, as I'm looking about your background and the places you have been and the organizations that you have gotten so much knowledge from, that you're showing your students what it is to be a lifelong learner. So it's very important that we do that and continue to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really easy to model for students. So when students ask me a question that and they do, they're seventh graders, they ask me questions I don't know the answer to all the time. And when I first started teaching, that caused me a lot of and I say to them, guys, it's impossible for me to know everything about everything there is. And I said, there will be stuff all the time that I don't know the answer to that. And then we talk about how do we find it, and we find it together. And I think that, a lot of teachers enter teaching and they think they have to be the expert on everything. And I think that my students learn probably more when I'm not the expert, because we look together and we learn together.
That's so powerful.
And to show students that you're human.
Do you have any, I know this summer you were going to some workshops, and because of COVID, where were you going to go this summer to continue, your learning experience?
So I was going to do a Freedoms Foundation. They were doing the two capitals, so the capital of the Union and the capital of the Confederacy. So I would have been at Ford's Theater. I would have been at the Museum of the Civil War in Richmond, Virginia, which used to be called, I think it was the Museum of the Confederacy, but they changed the name of it over time. But I was supposed to be, and I just thought that was such a cool thing because the capitals of the Union and the Confederacy are so close to each other and just yet so far apart. You know what I mean? Like they're so geographically close to each other, but, years apart or, centuries apart in their opinions and their differences, and so it just is, I thought that was going to be a really amazing program to go to. And then I was supposed to be at the Constitution Center. So I'm on the teacher advisory board for the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. And I was going to be there and actually helping with one of their teacher institutes on federalism. So, but COVID had other plans. So they ended up doing all their programs online this summer. And after staring at my screen from March to June, I just could not face a whole week of staring at a screen again. So
I understand.
So those opportunities are waiting for me next summer.
And yes, I was just going to mention that I hope they're still waiting for you next summer. So listeners, I want you to understand that Beck Stevens, as a 24-year teacher now, is continuing to expand her knowledge, continuing to be a lifelong learner. So she's able to share that knowledge with her students and get her students excited about American history. And we see this and understand this, what's going on in the classrooms today. So Beck, I want to thank you for coming and sharing with us and be an example to all of us teachers for what you are doing and what you have done and what you're continuing to do with your students and in your own professional growth as an historian. So thank you for coming and sharing with us these past two shows.
Well, thank you very much. It was my privilege and honor to be a part of this.
And we're going to have Beck come back and talk to us more, particularly about Philip Skeen and Fort Ticonderoga and some other things that you would love to share with us. So, Beck, please, we want to have you back, and I hope you're willing to do that.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you again for sharing with us. This is 1180 AM WFYL, working for your liberty.
The Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
When you experience the loss of a loved one, you can trust the Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory to guide you through the arrangements necessary to create a meaningful ceremony that celebrates the unique life being honored. Our staff is committed to providing your family with the highest quality of care and service in your time of need. We take pride in our responsibility to lighten your burden as you take the first step towards healing. Ask us about how we create a unique service for your loved one. Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory also helps with planning ahead so all the details of the service are taken care of. Ask us how we can connect you with grief support networks in your area. Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory has the resources to compassionately guide you through the loss of your loved one.
Contact us at 610-272-1941. That's 610-272-1941. Or visit our website at myersfh.com. That's MEYERSFH.com.